Welcome back. So our small sphere is capable of moving itself, and it's moving in a circular arc. But as I previously mentioned, I want this sphere to only last for a short period of time and then wink out of existence. I want it to destroy itself, but I don't want it to simply disappear. I want it to smoothly go from its normal size down to 0. Now, we've already learned about interpolation, and that is one possibility. We could interpolate its size down to 0 after a certain amount of time. But what I'd rather do is use a new concept called a timeline. Let's see how the timeline works. Let's say that our sphere is supposed to wink out of existence or simply shrink down to 0 after a period of time. Now, we've learned about how timers are better than delays because delays cannot be canceled, but timers can. So I'd like to start winking out of existence after a certain amount of time, and I'd like to use a timer for that. So first of all, we're going to use set timer. And once again, we're going to use set timer by event. I'm going to hook that up, and we're going to need a custom event. So I'm going to right-click, type custom event, and add a custom event. And our new custom event is going to be what starts our timeline. So I'm going to call this wink out. And I'm going to connect this to the timer. It's not going to be looping. We only want to wait a certain amount of time before wink out is executed. Now the time is going to be how long our sphere is supposed to live. In other words, it's the lifetime of the sphere. So I'm going to promote this to a variable and call it lifetime. And lifetime can be initialized to, let's say, a couple seconds. So I'm going to compile and set lifetime to 2. So we know that wink out will be executed after 2 seconds from begin play. Now, what happens when we wink out? This is where I'd like to create a timeline. So it may be confusing. Timers and timelines sound like the same thing, but they're not the same thing. A timeline is different, as we're about to see. So right-click and type timeline, and at the very, very bottom, we have the option to add a timeline. It has a little clock next to it. And as soon as we add one, we have a new timeline node and the opportunity to rename it. So I'm going to call this wink out timeline. And as soon as wink out is executed, I'd like to play this timeline. So I'm going to hook up my wire to play. Now these things are getting a little jumbled, so I'm going to move tick down and give us room. And we're going to take a look at what the timeline can do. To do that, we can open our timeline. We can double click on it, and here's the timeline. Now timelines require a track. We add a track with plus track, and we're going to do that now. And as you can see, we have several types of tracks. We're going to start with the most basic, the float track. So click add float track, and we can name this track. Now the track is going to be for the scale of our sphere. We're going to scale it down. So I'm going to call this scale and hit enter. Now a timeline has a length of time. It's set to 5 seconds by default, at least in this engine version, but this can be any length of time we specify here. I'd like to specify a time of 0.5. That's 0.5 seconds. And in the timeline, we're going to create a curve. A curve can be a straight line or it can be curvy. And when the timeline is played, it's going to output a value. That value is going to be determined by this curve. Let's see what we mean. To make a curve, we need to add keys. To add a key, we right-click anywhere on our timeline and select Add Key to our curve float. And we now get this blue diamond that has 2 quantities, time and value. We can also click and drag this key around, and we typically want a key at time 0 so we can determine what value our curve starts at. Now I'm going to use this curve to scale my sphere down from a scale of 1 to a scale of 0. So at time 0, I want a value of 1. That's going to push my key up and off the screen. But these two icons here allow us to scale our timeline to fit all the keys. So if I zoom to fit vertical, my key will be right there, and I can scroll out with my mouse wheel to see it there. Now I'd like another key. So I'm going to right click and add a key, and I'd like this key at the end of the timeline and its value to be at 0. So I'm going to set its time to 0.5. That's how long my timeline is, and its value to 0. Now, whenever this timeline is played, all it's going to do is output a float value. At the beginning of the timeline, it'll output a value of 0.5, and subsequently every single frame after that, it'll give me values on this curve. It's actually a straight line, so we can call it a linear curve. And until we get to 0.5 seconds, we're going to get values that are continuously getting smaller and smaller until finally at time 0.5 seconds, we're getting a value of 0. And the curve doesn't have to be linear like this. We can drag to highlight both keys, right-click on one of them, and we have different types of key interpolation. If we choose auto, all of a sudden, we don't have a straight line anymore. It's a curve. And we can even select each individual key, and we have handles that we can use to rotate and change what the curve looks like. I'm going to leave them as is. And now we have this curve that will smoothly go from a value of 1 to a value of 0. Okay, now that we've added a curve to our timeline, let's go back out to the event graph and take a look at our timeline node. The timeline is going to play as soon as the flow of execution reaches the play input pin. In other words, once wink out, our custom event is called by our timer, which will be 2 seconds after begin play. Wink out will start the timeline. And from that point on, our timeline will provide values every frame until the timeline is finished, which is half a second later. During that time, while the timeline is playing, the update output execution pin is going to be executed every single frame, kind of like tick, at least during the time when the timeline is playing. When it's finished, update will stop executing, and finished will execute a single time. Now, while the timeline is playing and update is executing every frame, the timeline is outputting a value. It's a float because we made a float curve, and we called that float curve scale. So we know we'll be getting a value between 1 and 0, 1 when the timeline starts, values that are getting smaller as the timeline is playing according to our curve, and 0 at 0.5 seconds. So while the timeline is playing for update, I want to scale our sphere mesh down. So I'm going to, first of all, get my sphere mesh out here, drag off of it, and I'm going to set world scale 3D. So the function set world scale 3D, if we select that, requires a new scale. You see, objects have scales stored as a 3D vector because you can scale an object in 3 dimensions. Let's go back to the viewport and take a look at our sphere and select our sphere mesh and look at its scale. X, Y, and Z are components of the scale vector. Let's just click and drag on the X component of the scale to scale up our sphere in the X direction. It's stretching in the X direction. And if we stretch it in the Y direction, it stretches in the Y direction. And if we stretch in the Z direction, well, we can see what that looks like. I'm going to hit the curved arrow though, because I don't want that scale non-uniform like that. I want it just set to 1. But in our event graph, on update for our timeline, I'd like to scale our sphere mesh according to the values output here. In other words, 1, which is the normal scale at the beginning of the timeline, but smoothly going down to 0. And I'm going to scale all 3 components of this scale vector. Now we can make a vector. We can right-click and type make vector. And we can make a new vector whose components X, Y, and Z are all equal to this scale returned from the timeline. So I'm going to go ahead and just make a vector and pass that in. Now, You might be asking, well, couldn't we have just split this struct pin and passed in scale for all three? Yes, there are multiple ways to do the same thing. So if you wanted to do it that way, by all means, feel free. Now we need to hook up update to set world scale 3D, like this. And we know that 2 seconds after begin play, this timeline will play, and it's going to take 0.5 seconds for the scale to go from 1 to 0. Let's just see what that looks like. We'll go ahead and press play, wait 2 seconds, and there it goes. It winked out. Let's just look at that again in case you missed it. I'm going to hit F11 to full screen and Alt-P to play. And there it goes. Hitting F11 to get out of full screen. We now see how our sphere is winking out of existence. Now, something important to note, that doesn't mean the sphere is gone, right? In fact, if I press play and immediately pause, and go to my outliner to find that sphere, it's right here, BP small sphere. And if I go ahead and resume, there it goes. It's winked out of existence, but BP small sphere is still in the world. It's important to understand that because as long as this actor is still in the world, it's still taking up resources, and we should destroy the actor once we no longer need the actor. And that's where our timeline's finished output pin comes in handy. As soon as this timeline is finished, we can destroy the actor by calling destroy actor. So timelines are very useful, and one advantage is that they don't use the tick function. If we were, say, interpolating in the tick function, we would be doing so every single frame. And while timelines do execute their update every single frame while the timeline is running, once the timeline is over, they stop executing the update every frame, and they simply execute their finished output pin just once, which is extremely useful. Now, there are a number of other nodes on the timeline, and most of them are self-explanatory. We can stop the timeline by having some flow of execution reach the stop pin. We can even reverse the timeline. But for now, all we need the timeline to do is scale our sphere down. And that we have accomplished. Now, if you're tempted to highlight all of these nodes and try to collapse to a function, it won't work. In fact, we'll get an error. And if we show the message log, we see that wink out timeline cannot be placed in a function graph. It's one of those types of nodes that cannot be put in a function. And you might think that, well, this is kind of terrible how we can't put everything into a function in blueprints. How are we going to keep things from getting out of hand? What if we have lots of these nodes that can't be put in functions? Well, the reason is because as soon as we call a function, everything in that function has to be executable right away. These latent types of nodes that take place over time, these can't be placed in functions. However, we can place the nodes that it executes in a timeline, such as setting the world scale 3D. Now, I'm going to show you an annoying quirk when it comes to collapsing nodes to a function. Notice that these nodes here, not including destroy actor, because that's hooked up to the finished execution wire. We don't want to package that. We want to package these nodes into a function. But notice that the nodes I have highlighted have several wires connecting to them. We have the execution wire. There's one of those. But we have 3 float values connected to our make vector. Let's see what happens if we collapse to a function. Look at that. We have 3 input floats for x, y, and z. Now, we don't need 3 input floats because they're all the same value. But we got 3 because 3 wires were hooked up to the nodes that we highlighted. So instead of doing that, what we can do is we can hold Control and click and take these 3 wires out of the scale, release, and search for reroute. And add a reroute node here, and then connect those to scale. That way, if we highlight these nodes, including the reroute, we only have 1 wire going in to our selection. And if we collapse this to a function, we have 1 wire going in. So this function is going to be scale sphere. And the input pin is going to be scale. And now we have a nice handy little node that sets the scale. And I can bring this destroy actor node down. And now we have our timeline, and it's really nice and really neat. And we can double click to go into scale and see exactly what it's doing. Perfect. Okay, great. So now that we have our wink out timeline, we know what our spheres are going to do when they wink out. And if you don't like 0.5 seconds, by all means, come in here and change it. You're going to need to change two things. The key at the end needs to be set to the new time. Let's say you want 0.25 seconds instead of 0.5. But also the timeline itself has to be set to your new time. The end time should now be 0.25 and not 0.5. So our timeline should now have a length of 0.25. And I can click on Zoom to Fit Horizontal to see a stretched version of the curve. Pretty nifty. So now that it takes 0.25 seconds to play the timeline, let's see what that looks like in our game. There we have it. It's a lot faster. So now we know how to use timelines, and our spheres only last for 2 seconds before they wink out of existence, which is great. Excellent job, and I'll see you in the next video.